My name is Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, and you are listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast, the show about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Thanks for joining us. Governed access plus pervasive protection for data, apps, hosts, containers, and serverless. This is the proper foundation for the journey to the cloud. Prisma, the industry's most complete cloud security suite, helps customers accelerate their journey with risk visibility and consistent security. Learn more at prisma.io. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning for the New Stack's Pancake Breakfast. Appreciate you getting up at this early hour for some pancakes. We have a morning where we're going to talk about cloud native security, and the first thing I'd like to do is thank our sponsor, Prisma of Palo Alto Networks. Let's give them a big hand. We have these pancake breakfasts pretty much all over the world where there's a KubeCon event and where there's other events. And we developed these from the start just to think how we could start the day by having a discussion. And so this is less of a panel and more of a chance for you to ask questions. To help you think of a question, we actually have a prize here. It's the Lenovo 700 Ultra Portable Bluetooth speaker, and as I understand, it is waterproof. So you can go to the beach or I guess wade in the water with your Bluetooth speaker. So here's the deal. You've all received a ticket. Has everyone received a ticket? Okay, if you haven't received a ticket, let us know. Now, if you ask a question, you get 5 additional tickets. So your chances of winning increase just a bit. So have your questions ready. We're trying to make these questions that we're hoping that you might ask, but we're really trying to get into better understanding what issues that you're facing and how you are trying to resolve these issues, and maybe some of the questions you ask will help do that. So let me just get started by introducing who we have on the discussion today on our panel. We have Keith Mokris of Palo Alto Networks. Hi, Keith. Keith is a product manager at Palo Alto Networks. We have Maya Kaczorowski, product manager at Google. We have Sarah Allen, co-chair of the CNCF SIG Security Group. Sean Michael Kerner, senior editor at Internet News, longtime journalist, and Santiago Torres-Arias, PhD student at NYU Center for Cybersecurity. I have a question, though, to start with the audience. How many people are developers in the audience? Good sizable group. How many people would say they're in IT? Another good sizable group. How about security? Great. And DevOps? As we often see the people raising their hands as developers in IT also raise their hands as DevOps, so that's understandable. So I want to just get started by asking the panelists a question. And one of the questions we have is about cloud native security. And cloud native security, I think, has an association with modernization to some extent, however you define modernization. Or it represents that journey that we've seen people go through where they've gone from data center focused environments to infrastructure as a service to now an environment where there's more dependencies, where they're facing not just one cloud, as we were talking about Santiago, but any number of cloud services out there. So my question for Keith is, what is the approaches you're seeing people taking? What is that issues that they're facing? Are they doing this? Are they trying to accomplish things all at once? Are they doing it pragmatically by workload? What are some of the behaviors you're starting to see in the community out there?
Yeah, I think one of the things when I look out at this group is I think the people in this room play a vital role in securing cloud native applications, because the development and DevOps groups that you're all a part of ultimately hold a lot of power in this ecosystem and a lot of responsibility for the applications you're building and deploying. And so with Twistlock, one of the things we commonly see now, part of Prisma at Palo Alto Networks, is this notion that we want to essentially control what's happening with our pipelines. So let's make sure that when it comes to our builds, everything that we have in our registry, we have visibility there to at least know that we're deploying applications securely from a pipeline standpoint. I think for us, we see a lot of organizations also looking at everything from kind of an application standpoint. And so that also becomes an on-ramp for starting to integrate security by application group or by product group. Those are both really common scenarios.
So I'll echo that a little bit, and kind of what we're hearing from members of the security group, what I'm seeing from developers in the field is integrating security into the CI/CD, right, into the pipeline, and that it's not that the cloud and modern practices are they have evolved in parallel, right? We saw test-driven development, agile, kind of grew up around the prominence of the cloud. And so most developers I know, once they do something, they want to make sure it's not going to stop happening. And so having CI/CD into it is, having it integrated into CI/CD is, I think, a critical part of the growing practice. And we're seeing projects like OPA also have a test suite to test it. And I think more of the security projects are integrating testing into their offerings.
Do you see that, Maya, or do you see other factors?
I think that's right. I think you see a lot of security going into the CI/CD pipeline. But if you're talking about initially moving to cloud native, that's not where people start. So people start by saying, your boss told you you're going to use Kubernetes. And you're like, oh, okay. And so now you have to implement Kubernetes, you have to learn what it is, and you have to start to use it. You started to move to containers, you started to move to microservices. And then 6 months later, a year later, you realized, oh, it would all have been easier if I had put some enforcements and some checks in my CI/CD pipeline. But that's not where you started. You started by moving existing workloads into containers, by moving VMs into containers. If you were really lucky, only greenfields. And so that's kind of the migration that we're seeing, is people starting to move at least new workloads, learning new development methods and new tools, and then maturing and getting into the CI/CD pipeline and getting into more complex policy management and things like that.
Santiago?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a question of practicality. I don't think there's a point in which you say, oh, I finally switched to cloud native completely. You are doing a gradual rollout of your deployments, and as you move things from old legacy systems into new infrastructure, you start moving the new challenges with it. And I think that when you're moving things, you also want to start adding transparency. You want to do a gradual rollout of your security policies. I think Sarah is very right in saying that even though it will not happen immediately that you have fully cloud-native application deployed, you will have certain elements that you can start having visibility on and start gating your deployment in a more smart, more future-proofing type of way.
So Sean, what's the big story out there?
The big story out there for me is that cloud native, outside of this conference, so I'll be the contrarian, is a meaningless buzzword because I get it endlessly. It's sort of like open source, which has a definition, and cloud, which has a NIST definition, but nobody uses it. If you look on the CNCF GitHub repo for cloud native, they actually have a definition, which they're constantly evolving. They just changed it, I think, 2 weeks ago to add service mesh in there. So it's a definition that is always being redefined. So just start with that. It's a word that is nice, but it means different things, and it's always changing. For me, it's also a story very much like Maya was saying. It's a crawl, walk, run kind of thing. It always starts with a shift to something else. So when I get pitches in my inbox as a journalist, half of them are for things that are actually only running on-premise or on-premises. Nothing is on-premise. I write stories on-premise, but I deploy on-premises. That's our AP-style guide top tip for the week. But you always start on premises.
We have this debate all the time.
There you go. Just about anybody that starts with Kubernetes will start with Minikube, and that's on premises, and you can learn a lot by doing things that way.
So we have Joe Jackson in the audience. I have a question. I think we need one more microphone.
I just want to point out, if you say on-prem, you don't have to worry about the S.
On-prem? Is that just the way to go? Who says on-prem here? Yeah, all right, on-prem for the win.
work for you.
On-prem for the win. Is there a question? I'd love to get a first question. Is there something? We have a question right here. So once Job gets the mic, maybe we could just get one from the audience, right, from the panel. All right. State your name and your company, if you please.
Sure. My name's Andy Feller. I work with bandwidth.com. And so one of the questions I constantly have to ask and kind of work within my organization is saying, going from virtual machines into containers into Kubernetes, what is kind of like the bar that we set? Somebody who works in like UX or in developer experience or in systems or product development or in DevOps or platform engineering, right? Like, all these additional layers, there's more that people have to know. And so we're trying to find the sweet spot of, how do we guarantee visibility into security issues without like overtaxing people with, having to carry a, an 800-ton like toolbox around because they don't live in those worlds all the time.
Who wants to talk about the 800-ton toolbox?
I'll answer it a little bit. I think the open source projects, the tools, have to work a little bit harder to build secure practices in. Kind of like I talked about, the projects having testing that verifies your security, that we can't just leave everything to the developers and just be like, okay, here we go, here's a sharp knife. It's sharp on both ends, wear gloves, and we don't have any gloves for you. It's really, really hard to design something to be secure by default because secure by default means you can't use it, it's locked in a closet. But I do think we can make it easier to produce something secure and that the developers of things that have APIs used by other developers have an obligation to do so.
I think you need to be clear what your goals are going to be. So you're saying, like, what's my target for UX or for developers or things like that? Like, if your goal in moving to cloud native was to go faster, right? That's usually a lot of organizations' goals. Then are you actually doing that? Are you actually able to do that? And it might take you 18 months to get back to your normal speed, and like that's totally okay. But like have that mindset of what the long-term goal is. From a security point, or sometimes it's to save costs. That's another common one that I hear. But that's typically not just going to cloud native. It's cloud native plus a migration and some other stuff. From a security point of view, what I would look at were things like time to patch. In theory, moving to containers should make it easier for you to patch your workloads. Can you actually patch faster, and are you actually patching faster? And is that helping you deliver and maintain a better security posture than you had before? I would look at some of we're talking about security by default. I agree, nothing is secure by default. There's always going to be some customization. Is that going to cost you less in terms of like tech debt than it did before? Those are some of the metrics I would try to like tease out and see if that was worth it.
Sean.
Yeah, some of the things that I see as best practices in organizations that can get away with it is from a security side or from a CISO or CIO side is they'll define the development environment as a relatively locked down set of assets. Because one of the largest risks with security is not knowing what's out there, right? The whole shadow IT thing. So if you have a self-servicing ITSM, whatever model you want to call it, where you only allow developers to provision from what you give them, you know what you're providing them, you can manage that at the patch level, the configurations, so that baseline level of a maybe not secure by default, but secure by intention framework is great. And then you'll know theoretically what they're using. And then you should always be scanning to make sure that people aren't using things that aren't in your network or things that you haven't allowed. Because when you know, then you can manage. You can't manage what you can't see. You can't manage what you can't control, and that represents an unbounded risk. And in security, that's always something you don't want.
I'll piggyback.
I wanted
off.
to add to sorry.
Go ahead.
Maya was talking about.
Yeah.
I think I wanted to ask the crowd who has a disclosure and vulnerability report and disclosure policy here.
A vulnerability report and disclosure policy. Who has one?
Okay, so that's exactly why I think it's because time to patch is a great metric on how are you treating your security issues. But if you don't know what to patch, and people are able to tell you, hey, you should patch this, or this is a problem, or there's a vulnerability issue, then your time to patch is by default going to be close to infinite. So I would like to underline that. I think it's important for companies and projects to have a very well-defined policy on how to report or have vulnerabilities reported to you, and how to address them, and how to communicate to users that was an exploit or a compromise or something of that sort, so they can take measures themselves.
Keith.
Yeah, one of the, so I was presenting at a user conference with Palo Alto Networks last week, and it was really fun. My co-presenter was on the CI/CD group at an organization, and at the conference, a security leader approached him, and they had not actually connected before. And it was really exciting to see, one, kind of the goals from the CI/CD group, as they're the ones who are really responsible for implementing a lot of security as part of pipelines, and then the security group, who in a lot of ways has a lot of different reporting metrics when they're trying to show security not just with cloud native apps, but much more globally. And so I think understanding, step one, like everyone here has shared, is I want to get visibility. I want to start prioritizing risk. But then ultimately, how do I just even get these teams communicating at my organization to understand we all have different roles and responsibilities to contribute with all these different abstraction layers that are also a challenge. And so it was really fun to see that firsthand. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations, the more they can do that, the more success they'll find in this cloud native world.
Job has the mic. We have another question. We have several questions. Great. Your name and your company, please.
Yeah, my name is Prashanta. I'm from Ericsson. The question is, I think, more to what Maya said, that when we try to move our workload to cloud-native infrastructure, I think it's quite a bit of work, from on-prem to container, then Kubernetes. Now, putting it all together, I think developers' first priority is to make it all work. And at that point, security take a backstage. And then finally, when you make it work, we see that it is not secured. And by then it is too late, because from business point of view, it's the time to move to the production. Now, is it possible that depending on the nature of the business, when we take the cloud native infrastructure and we can set the level of security that is needed, like is it low, medium, or high, and that is given to the developer to start with, rather than coming late and try to secure the infrastructure when we are about to go to production.
So the question about kind of what are the levels that a developer can see in terms of the threat?
Correct.
What you're talking about is kind of like shifting left in general, right? So the idea of moving security to earlier and earlier in your CI/CD pipeline. Ideally, you would give developers feedback as early as possible that they are not doing something securely. And I say that kind of loosely because unless you've built a CI/CD pipeline that's really fully integrated from like code to build to test to everything, you probably don't have the capability to do that today. You're probably giving them feedback at the very last step, like you're describing, and saying, oh, sorry, this test is failing, you can't deploy that. And that's really frustrating for a developer who spent like days building something, and then 2 weeks later or a month later gets told, sorry, that can't get pushed to production, you have to go change this one config or something like that. So there's a benefit to when you're building that pipeline out and building out your plan, just if you even just work on integrating all those pieces together, then that I think already provides you better security in the sense that you can give feedback faster, and so developers can keep going fast and still try to meet security requirements. I realize that's kind of a terrible solution, but it's better than nothing, I think, and that's kind of my goal.
I think the question was, Sarah, that there's an issue with how, if you're moving over to these new types of infrastructure, these new application environments, what can the developer do to know what actually is a threat or what's not? And so so these automated ways to tell with I think red, yellow, green kind of environments.
So yeah, I think that, to Maya's point, collaboration between the security teams and the developers is critical. Like by the time you're writing code, it's kind of late to realize that you're designing a system that can't be secured, right?
So that gets to the point of collaboration, which is a tenet of open source in many ways, right? So a lot of companies don't have even open source policies in place.
Well, I think it's open source help. If people are like really practiced doing open source, then they're hopefully practiced doing collaboration, but it's not a requirement. You can, I worked at Macromedia in the 90s, and everything was closed source and proprietary.
And you collaborated.
And we worked with the security team. the nascent internet team and the people who locked down our network because we were doing things that were fundamentally different because we were allowing external users to run software on our network, right? That was not a thing before for that company, right? And so the cloud is really analogous, right? You are, as a developer, allowing your users to do things that previously weren't allowed. And so you don't really understand that because, well, I used to do it and now I'm still doing it. I'm building the same software, but you're fundamentally changing the risk profile for the company.
Right.
And you can't possibly understand that because you didn't set up the whole cluster. You didn't set up everything underneath you. So it has to be a collaboration or it's just not going to function.
Sean.
Yeah, my only point is, when we're talking about shift left, if you're going to shift left, shift all the way to the left. And for me as a developer, that's an IDE. So if you're helping your developers, and they're using Visual Studio, Eclipse, JetBeans, whatever IDE it is, you get plugins in there that will do static analysis, dynamic analysis, testing right in the IDE. So forget about, security is great, but if the developer sees, they've made a type inference, they've made a mistake in their code, in their IDE, then it's as far left as you can get, you're fine. And then my only other thing is move everything to Rust and Go, because then you save memory errors. There you go.
It's really easy, right? It's like
Really easy. Move everything to Rust and Go. You eliminate an entire set of vulnerabilities. But that's not going to go over in this room. But do it.
Anyone else have a thought?
I also just wanted to make a word of warning. I don't think that you can catch everything with automated tools. And I think what Sarah was also saying is you want to collaborate with a team, with a group of humans that are able to tell you, hey, have you considered this part of your threat model? Did you notice that you have publishing your infrastructure on this cloud? And we recently read a news article that these guys are doing this particular thing weird or wrong. All of these things are very hard to put on a computer. And when you are trying to evaluate risk, humans are way better than computers doing it.
Keith, have any thoughts, or should we move on to the next question? Let's move on. All right. Well, Keith is ready for your questions.
Plus one to everyone up here.
Yeah. So it's questions here. We have one right here. Great. And if you just tell us your name and your company.
My name is Anjali Google, and I work at Cisco Systems.
Great.
So my question is relating, so there is more focus on standardizing or secure infrastructure as a service for all the CNCF, but there is also need for data protection and privacy, because with multi-cloud providers, we have to make sure the boundaries where the data flows in line, in transit, at rest. And it's very hard for us to basically take the consent of your customers, the data flows between different cloud providers, and preserving privacy. So I don't see much traction in that area. So just wanted your views on that.
Identity management.
Yeah, governance basically.
Yeah. I'll respond first. I think that's going to be, one of our biggest continued investments at Palo Alto Networks, because we continue to find more and more organizations are multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. And so how do you prioritize risk in ephemeral environments, diverse environments with a lot of abstractions in a consistent and manageable way? So I think a lot of what we're doing with Prisma is looking to address that purely from the sense that organizations want to be able to implement some sort of security consistency. And how do they do that both at a global level and a very granular level? And so I think that's one of the big opportunities throughout the cloud native space, where you're going to continue to see more and more organizations addressing that.
I think consistency there is the real point, right? As you start to go multi-cloud or hybrid, not necessarily having the same exact control across multiple places, but having the same intent with that control. So you might say, I want all my data to be encrypted, and you might have different encryption algorithms used across multiple clouds, or different key management systems or whatever used across clouds. I think that's fine, as long as you're meeting that minimum bar that you set for yourself. Practically, I don't know of a good way to do this yet. I think there will be more and more people building kind of multi-cloud policy tools. I think you mentioned OPA earlier. OPA is a very powerful tool to do kind of admission control across workloads. And so you could see, for example, requiring that you only deploy workloads onto a cloud or a location that meets some set of requirements. I think that'd be a really interesting type of control to implement. What I will say, you mentioned privacy a couple times. That's really interesting to me because we spend a lot of time thinking about privacy, like internally, obviously.
Right.
But I haven't seen a lot of privacy engineering yet in cloud native, and I think it's going to be an interesting. I mean, it's true in general. I don't think a lot of people outside of the top like 5, 10 big tech companies really care enough about privacy yet, and we're going to see a lot more controls around that hopefully in the next couple of years.
Well, I think that I see like with GDPR, more and more engineers I know, right, are working for companies who are not solving, like, it's just too complicated to do country-specific privacy stuff, right? And that it's easier to say, okay, we're going to just treat all PII this way. We're going to create these capabilities consistently for all our customers. And I think that's a great sign. And I think the key thing when it comes to privacy is to often the developers don't have clear definitions about what they're supposed to do, right? And if you don't have the like, there's two kinds of policy, right? There's the words that the organization says you're supposed to follow. And then there's the implementation of those policy controls. And frequently I see organizations let the developers talk directly to the lawyers with like no disintermediation, and the definitions are inconsistent from group to group because individual developers have to go check with individual lawyers, and you can't implement anything consistent that way. So
That sounds like collaboration.
collaboration even with the lawyers.
No, seriously, no. I'm curious on how, on how you view just identity management in terms of your own operations, right? I mean, in terms of your own infrastructure. But I mean, Sean, you talk to a lot of people out there.
Well, I know our friends at Google have Beyond Corp, which is a wonderful way to manage trust because it's zero trust. You trust no one. Because when your fundamental silicon infrastructure could be possessed by zombies, there's a shout out to Zombieland 2, none of you are patched, we're all in trouble. You can't trust anything. So I know Cisco has a zero trust methodology as well. So you start off with zero trust, you trust nothing, you inspect everything. And then as an overlay on top of that, because there's always things that can get through, while humans are nice, I believe that humans can be a weak link sometimes and a strong link sometimes. There are some interesting things that I know we're talking cloud native at this conference, but AWS has something called Macy, artificial intelligence that will look for personally identifiable information, privacy violations, et cetera, just all with machine learning automatically and flag it, because at a global scale, humans are not going to catch it. So consider zero trust for everything, and then after the fact, inspect with some kind of machine learning to see if you have violations.
But Santiago, that leads to questions about dependencies because, in a zero trust environment, how do you think about dependencies?
Well, that's a very good question. There's an aspect of open source that it is very overlooked, and many of you are probably running software that was written by somebody who had their website hacked 3 times in the last 10 years. It is serving their sources on an unauthenticated FTP server, and there's no signature over that tarball. That is a dependency of probably every single web browser and everything that is rendering a TIFF image. And many of you are not even looking at TIFF images today. Now, I think when we talk about shifting left, we also want to talk about shifting left from the developer and what the developer is pulling in, and having transparency of how this pipeline is working in terms of dependencies and like things that you inherit from further left, to say it somehow. Right.
Yeah, and Santiago's probably humbled to not mention Intoto. So he's a project maintainer for Intoto, which was just accepted into the CNCF, which helps manage your, knowing that your supply chain is delivering what you expect it to. And we're seeing more and more tools like this emerge that are essential. And I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of people who are new to Kubernetes or new to cloud native, whatever that buzzword means, who expect that it's all here and we've figured everything out. And in a lot of ways, security, we have the same problems we've always had with security. It's just that insider threat was really hard before. You had to get into a locked room and, get into computers, and now everything is controlled by software, and it's much easier, like the attack surface is much easier to get at. And so we need things that used to be kind of easier to prioritize low or not do at all are like essential. And most companies I know are like, it's do it yourself and bash scripts, and we're seeing new tools emerge, and we need to share practices and have more of these.
Google has an open source project that's similar to Intodo, as I understand, as well. Graphius?
Grapheus and
Grapheus,
Kritis. Grapheus is a metadata store for information about your container images, so things like vulnerabilities. It's a fairly structured offering. And Kritis is an admission controller that can let you choose to admit containers to your workload, whether or not they meet metadata requirements from Grapheus. So they work together to be able to be that last point enforcement mechanism for your workloads.
Great.
I think Intodo is actually complementary to Grapheus. Maybe you can explain?
Yes, thank you. So with Grapheus, you have a very rich descriptive element of your cloud-native deployment. With Intodo, you can provide signed attestations that change things together. At the end of the day, a supply chain is a chain, and every single node that's an element to your supply chain is taking things in and spitting them out. So you want to keep integrity over those, and you can also use this integrity guarantees that Intodo gives you to further get insights, or like to get a trusted way to analyze a specific deployment, a vulnerability scan, a build stage, a version control system. These two play very well together. I think on a talk today or tomorrow of Grapheus, there's going to be a little bit more insight on how Intodo can live inside of a Grapheus server, and you can use both to get very strong security guarantees on your software supply chain.
Terrific. Let's get some more questions.
Yeah, before I raise my question, the first thing is that about Anjali's comment about privacy. I'm from Accenture. I work on privacy-related issues. So the best way to address that is to anonymize all the data so that you're not storing clear data anywhere, especially when it comes to PII, PHI. And now coming to my question about behavioral security analytics. So we manage a lot of, we manage platforms where we deploy a lot of applications. So we require like a new generation firewall. So from Palo Alto, I'm not familiar with all your offerings. Are there firewalls moving in the behavioral analytics where many of the communication now starts from devices all over the world? So are the devices moving their location? Are the devices communicating with TPM identity? So in addition to the manual identity management, how do you manage the device's identity?
Yeah, so I'll begin this question by saying I'm in no ways a network security expert, but I think there's a couple of trends that we see at Palo Alto Networks that we're trying to address. One, Twistlock and everything we're doing as part of Prisma, looking at network security as a key component when it comes to securing microservices, especially applications running on top of Kubernetes. And so teaching security professionals that pods and containers can communicate across an application, across namespaces, or even across environments or with outside entities. And so that's certainly a problem that we're trying to address and has been foundational with Twistlock. And then more widely, if you're following what's happening with this notion of a secure access service edge, how do you secure branches, edge users, and devices on a global scale or for global enterprises? And so I think I would say follow what's happening with the secure access service edge space. That's a completely different product and group at Palo Alto Networks, but I certainly see there's a big story when it comes to not just how do I secure my cloud native applications, but how do I secure all the devices, all the users that are part of my enterprise.
I'm going to jump in. I have a couple of thoughts. There's a couple different identities you want to manage in your environment. User identities, service identities, right? We talk a lot about service meshes and how you have services authenticate to each other. And I'll give you two more. One is device identity, which is sort of what you're talking about, and it's really for us at Google to be on corp and how we think about user trust when they hit an application at the front end. And also say code identity, which is how do you know that the code that you're running is actually the code that you're meant to be running? So on the device identity bit, because that's kind of the bit you were talking about, caveat, I don't work on Beyond Corp, but we have talked about this quite a lot publicly. Google uses device identity as an additional factor in determining the level of trust of a user when they authenticate to Beyond Corp, to the Google front end. So a trusted device, for example, a device where there is a TPM that we can keep a private key in and we can verify the firmware of and ensure it follows secure boot and lots of other things, is more highly trusted than a device where you cannot do that. A device where the user has previously used and installed a certificate is more trusted than a device that does not have a certificate, et cetera. So that's typically in a corporate network application. There's actually a really good talk from the Open Source Summit in Lyon and from the Linux Security Summit that some of my colleagues have given on device identity specifically, if you're interested in that topic.
Just from my perspective, when I think about it from a product perspective, when people talk to me, user and entity behavior analytics, UEBA, is almost exclusively associated as a product category alongside SIM, Security Information Event Manager, because that is the source of truth in many organizations, because your user and entity behavior analytics is usually based on log data, and all that's with the SIM. So where that sits in a cloud native architecture, it's debatable, but that's usually the point of inspection for UEBA, is that sort of association. That tends to be where I see it.
You said cloud native.
I did. Sorry.
Go ahead, Santiago.
So I wanted to add something that you'll probably not like is you use the metaphor of a firewall or like new types of firewalls. And I think that there's a problem with the way that we're approaching security when we think that you can just buy a new firewall and get a new box and just stick it in the rack, or like now get a new vulnerability scanner and now you're secure. I think actual security, good security, requires you to take a good look at what your practices are, at what your human resources are, and how they all interact together, and actually define meaningful policies based on that. I think there's a trend of getting new vulnerability scanners or new services that scan your deployments, and then they can green light or yellow or red light your deployment. But although it's good, there's a danger of just thinking that you're secure just by sticking this thing into your pipeline and calling it a day.
I really want to actually build on that, Santiago. So like just like Beyond Corp for Google is about not having to trust the identity of the user that's authenticating to an application, cloud native security, sorry, Sean, is about you not having to know what the services in your infrastructure are with that much information and not trusting them inherently. That's zero trust model, right? I kind of love and hate that, I can't remember, it's either Gartner or Forrester, took zero trust to mean Beyond Corp. I'm like, no, zero trust for me is like Istio and it's service meshes, and it's the fact that I don't have to trust one microservice from another, and I have to authenticate every microservice, and I have to encrypt information that goes between these microservices, et cetera. Like, the idea of having a firewall around a corporate network also doesn't apply to your production network. Why would you have a firewall around your production network and then therefore think you're safe, right? You need to actually verify all those microservices within your production network and verify that they are the identities that they say they are. I think that's where cloud native is heading. Yeah.
Question.
Jennings Boley, Liberty Mutual. My question comes back to CI/CD and some of the topics we were talking on near the beginning. We've touched on a little bit the vulnerability scanning and the CI portion and service identity management. Are there other topics that the panel wanted to kind of enumerate that they're thinking about in terms of CI/CD?
I could just say, just from my perspective, I think CI/CD, and it's not always talked about as part of the pipeline, but you can inject static analysis, dynamic analysis, gating as part of the pipeline. So that way, if something fails, the gate, it doesn't get merged. So not just as, a build success or build failure, but doing the scanning early on and then after additional merging. Just make sure you have those tools in there. It's just part of the process. So scanning is shifted left.
I'll point out 3 problems that I don't necessarily have solutions for. One is sort of the whole software supply chain and provenance of your code, which I think is what Santiago was getting at in terms of like, do you know where you're actually pulling containers or packages or whatever from? Another one is build time enforcement. We talk a lot about enforcement at deployment time. If you could actually do some of that enforcement and checks when you're building, that's, again, shifting things more left, feeding back to developers sooner. And the third one I'll point out is a break glass scenario. I think a lot of people think like, oh, I'll do all these controls and my developers will always do it and it'll be perfect. It's like, okay, reality is that sometimes you're not going to meet all those boxes and you're going to have to push code anyways. So having a way of dealing with that particular scenario and making sure you can audit that and making sure you can respond to that appropriately, I think is a really important control.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the sort of auditability, observability. We're seeing that, like, you know, in the old days, you used to have long development cycles, and you would deploy your application, and it would be a like, every deployment was atomic, and that was the whole thing, right? Going back to where we put stuff on floppy disks and sent it away. But now, it's you don't deploy your whole system at once, and often you might redeploy based on an alert that goes up that takes down a server that, you know, then stands it up again, and being able to reason about what exactly was running on this service at the time that it went down, and having an audit trail. It's not just for, I mean, it's really important for threats and for security, but sometimes things break because people make mistakes, and understanding where, you know, what's the root cause of something is essential. So, you know, having that transparency built into your system then becomes a sort of ecosystem of deploying code and building code.
Yeah, and I think one of the key goals that organizations should have is some notion of enforcement based on vulnerability or compliance policy as part of the build. I would definitely emphasize that that notion of enforcement is not something you are going to do on day one or even the first few days of your cloud native journey. Being able to start by prioritizing risk and kind of seeing your environment from kind of a more global perspective is usually kind of the starting point when it comes to visibility and starting to track, you know, where your greatest risk might be. But when you can get to enforcement, where you can get really granular with either OS packages or libraries that you're really familiar with, and saying we are definitely going to block critical vulnerabilities with a vendor fix in this specific application or for this specific library, once you get that familiarity, it can really allow you to implement enforcement correctly. And so making sure it's part of a longer process, which brings us back to collaboration, of course.
Last question.
Yeah, I just going further into that.
Your name and company?
Oh yeah, my name's Joaquin Menchaca. I'm with Clear Metal in San Francisco, and we're moving toward. We're halfway to immutable production using SaltStack, and we're moving to Kubernetes with Spinnaker. And so in our process, we'll have two discrete atomic pipelines. One will be for the CI, and one will be the CD. So I was wondering, in scope of that. With immutable production, what would you suggest would be for a CI? Because we don't need live scans and conformity on prod because these are immutable. And if something flipped, we just, you know, Phoenix pattern, destroy it, and recreate it. But what should we march out and what should we check to approve that artifact, the Docker image? And then also post, like say we're testing against a stage on a CD, and also to prod, what would we put in there? And then also adding on to that the infrastructure in general, outside the whole app-centric, but like the support of the app, you know, per se. So I guess getting more granular. And part of my experience is a lot of the problems is I see a lot of products out there, they're oriented toward mutable prod. It just doesn't make sense anymore, you know, for what we're doing.
So you're talking about like what specific checks you might want to make at deployment time for like your container images, or when you're scanning for your container images. For release as well, as part of the pipeline. So for containers specifically, I would look at things like known vulnerabilities. I think that's one of the easiest places to start in your images and packages. And then if you're going to want to actually scan, you know, like your Docker file or things like that, you can look at things like, do I have a seccomp profile? Am I running as root? What Linux capabilities am I allowing? Like those types of security controls. If you're looking at just packages and also container images that you're pulling, say, from Docker Hub or something, I would look at the age of the image or when it was last built. And then if you want to get really kind of crazy, you can start to look at things like how many maintainers are on this thing, et cetera. I don't know of any tool that does that yet, but that might be an interesting place to kind of go next in terms of your level of trust around some of these things that you're pulling in. To your point on them, I mean, these things are supposed to be immutable, so they shouldn't change after the fact. But like also, just scanning what you're going to deploy is not sufficient. You're going to also want to scan your environment from like a configuration point of view and see that it's still consistent with what you expected it to be ahead of time.
Exactly, and not only container images, but you can, for example, use services like kubesec to send your deployment YAML and have it statically analyzed and tell you, hey, you have a read-write file system mount that you should probably have there. I would also take a look at things like Docker Content Trust, so you can pull images that are signed, and even if they compromise the Docker Hub servers, if the image was signed with an offline key that was hosted somewhere else, you will be fine. You won't pull any tampered images, any malicious backdoored binaries from there.
Anyone else? Okay, well, that about sums it up. Let's give a big hand to the panel. And thanks to everyone who came for the breakfast. We sold out and you got here, and so thanks for joining us. We now are going to have a drawing. And so we are picking the ticket, and Sarah's going to read the number. So get your tickets ready. And here's the prize,
All right.
Lenovo.
703039.
Hey, we got a winner. Woo! Thank you, everyone. And last word, thank you to Palo Alto Networks for this breakfast. Let's give them a big hand. Governed access plus pervasive protection for data, apps, hosts, containers, and serverless. This is the proper foundation for the journey to the cloud. Prisma, the industry's most complete cloud security suite, helps customers accelerate their journey with risk visibility and consistent security. Learn more at prisma.io.
Listen to more episodes of the Newstack Analysts at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.